In the dark corners of the internet, beneath layers of conspiracy theories and half-truths, there existed a group of individuals whose curiosity was more dangerous than any weapon. They were a blend of misfits, tech geeks, amateur historians, and curious thrill-seekers. They had one thing in common: an obsession with a series of mysterious deaths. The first victim was found in an abandoned house, with a crumpled body lying in an unnatural position. The second came days later with a business executive, positioned as a ritualistic display. What for third was a prominent scientist who disappeared without a trace, only to reappear weeks later deep in the woods, lifeless and cold. The press dismissed it as a series of unrelated tragedies, but those seeking deeper answers were in high demand to solve it. The group began gathering information, piecing together a complex web of theories. There were links to a property, a piece of land that had been the subject of local legends for decades. People spoke of disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and a dark history tied to the land. Each death was a key to understanding the truth hidden beneath. Somewhere along the lines of history, the land had been used by government experiments, secretive tests under the guise of national security. But the experiments had gone horribly wrong, leaving behind more than just a scar on the landscape. What if the deaths were linked to these dark, forgotten endeavors? What if someone was trying to cover up the truth? A conspiracy, so deep and tangled that even the most seasoned investigators were afraid to touch it. The group began to grow more determined. They started looking into classified documents, interviewing those who had lived through the darkest years of the country's past. The mystery thickened. The deaths were not random. They were part of a pattern that connected back to the property, to the research that had taken place there, and to an experiment long buried by time and memory. But as the group delved deeper, strange things began happening. Unexplained errors flooded their computers, accounts were hacked, and strange people began watching them. It wasn't long before the conspiracy they had uncovered turned its attention toward them. The group, once united in their pursuit of truth, was now split by fear. Who could they trust if they were being watched? Was the government truly behind the deaths, or was there something else? Suspicion grew as some argued that they had uncovered a government cover-up. Others believed they were on the brink of exposing something far darker. No one could agree, but one thing was clear: the truth was out there, waiting to be unearthed. As the bodies mounted, it became evident that the mystery was far from solved. Each death seemed to hold a piece of a much larger puzzle, and the group, ever more fragmented, was being drawn into a storm that could destroy them all. The property was isolated, hidden away from the prying eyes of the world. Overgrown vegetation had long since swallowed the remains of any previous life, making it a perfect hiding place for whatever secrets lay buried. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if time itself had been arrested. The house that stood there wasn't ancient. Its windows, broken and shattered, were like eyes that had long since stopped seeing. The walls, weathered and cracked, whispered of a past that was best left forgotten. The deeper the group went, the more they realized that the deaths were not just the result of an experiment gone wrong. There were other forces at play, forces far more ancient, rooted in the land itself. The deaths were sacrifices, offerings to something that had not been seen for centuries. And those who had died were merely pawns in a game that had been set into motion long before they were born. They couldn't see it at first, only a lingering sense of dread. It was a slow realization, creeping into their minds like the cold winds that swept through the house. They weren't just dealing with human conspiracy. There was something else, something older, something far more dangerous. In the midst of their investigations, strange symbols began appearing on the walls, symbols that matched those found in forgotten texts that had once been used by the ancient cults. Whispers of long-abandoned rituals drifted through their minds. They began to realize that the deaths were not accidental, but deliberate. The land had been cursed, and those who had tried to uncover its secrets had paid the price. As the group slowly began piecing together the truth, they found themselves at odds with each other. Some argued that the deaths were the result of the experiments, that they had been orchestrated by a secret government program designed to experiment on human subjects. Others began to suspect that there was something far more sinister at play, something that had nothing to do with modern science or government oversight. The atmosphere was thick with paranoia, and each member of the group started questioning the motives of the others. In the midst of this, one final death occurred, the death that would reveal the truth. One of the group's members, a young man with a history in military intelligence, had disappeared without a trace. His last message was cryptic, a series of numbers and letters that made no sense. The rest of the group assumed the worst, that he had been taken by the same forces responsible for the deaths of the others. But when they returned to the property, they found something else. The young man had been marked. His body was displayed in a way that mirrored the ancient rituals described in the texts they had uncovered, and the symbols on the walls, once thought to be nothing more than strange markings, now glowed in the moonlight, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to call out to something. The final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The deaths had not been random. They had been orchestrated by a force beyond comprehension, something ancient and powerful that had been awakened by their meddling. The group's investigation had unknowingly stirred the pot, disturbing forces that had lain dormant for centuries. But the question remained, what would happen next? The group was fractured, scattered, but the answers they had uncovered would never leave them. The conspiracy they had uncovered was real, but it was only a small piece of a much larger and more dangerous puzzle. And as the last of the group vanished into the night, there was one final truth they had all learned. Some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Why did the building's architect disappear right after its opening? The question hooked Sasha the moment she saw it in a forum about urban legends. She had no idea this rabbit hole would nearly cost her everything. The Crescent Tower, infamous for its mysterious 13th floor, loomed in the city's skyline like a scar. Tenants avoided discussing it, maintenance workers refused to service it, and rumors claimed no one who entered the floor ever came back. But Sasha wasn't the type to scare easily. She was a crime podcaster, always hunting for the next big story. Sasha stood in the lobby, staring at the elevator panel. The button for floor 13 wasn't there, but she'd heard whispers about a backdoor access code. It took her 3 days and some highly illegal sleuthing to find it. 0313. Her heart pounded as the elevator jolted upward. Floor 12, 13. The doors slid open, revealing nothing but a dim, cold corridor that seemed to stretch infinitely. "Why is it so cold?" she muttered, stepping out. But her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The air felt heavy, like walking through syrup. Her flashlight flickered, and she cursed under her breath. Sudden creaks and noise like footsteps. "Hello," she called. No answer, just the rhythmic tap of shoes on the floor. But there was no one there. She spun around, her breathing shallow. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself. Yet the steps grew louder, closing in. Therefore, she bolted down the hallway, chasing the one door she could see at the end. It was marked with a brass plaque, Room 1306. Inside, the room looked untouched, frozen in time. A desk sat under a layer of dust, and on it, a journal. The first page read, March 13th, 1989. The experiment is complete. We've created something extraordinary. But I fear we've gone too far. Sasha's hands shook as she turned the pages. Most of it was incomprehensible scientific jargon, but phrases like extra-dimensional access and psychological deterioration jumped out. The entry stopped abruptly, followed by a splash of smeared ink. Something violent had interrupted the writer. But Sasha had no time to ponder. The footsteps were back, now sprinting toward her. She slammed the journal shut and scanned the room, only to realize that the room had no windows, no exits, just a vent too small to crawl through. Her flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, she saw a shadow that wasn't hers. It stretched unnaturally long before vanishing. She held the journal even tighter. A low voice echoed from the walls. "You shouldn't be here." "Why?" "Because you'll never leave." She threw the journal at the wall and bolted for the vent, which now, somehow, was open. On the other side of the vent was a gaping void, with a faint path leading to somewhere unknown. The void pulsed around her as she moved forward, every step feeling heavier than last. The whispering words that came through the walls felt like parasites in her brain. "What is this place?" She spun around to see a man, or what was left of him. His body flickered like the creature's, half-formed and fractured. He smiled, but it was devoid of warmth. "Are you the architect?" She demanded answers. "What did you build here? What is this place?" He tilted his head toward the door, as voices from the walls whispered that it shouldn't be opened. "Why build the door if it's not meant for opening? Please, make the voices go away." His smile widened unnaturally. "Let me go," she pleaded. "You can leave," the voices said, as he stepped aside to reveal a glowing door. "But you won't," he said, gesturing to the journal she had thrown at the wall earlier. "You came here for the answers, and now you're willing to leave without them?" She hesitated, torn between survival and the insatiable need for answers. The man laughed, with a hollow, echoing sound. "Curiosity doesn't kill here. It's the ones who stop seeking that truly die. Here, those who stay never die." The exit flickered. Time was running out. She made her choice. 2 weeks later, a new thread appeared on the Urban Legends forum. Anyone heard about the girl who vanished while investigating the Crescent Tower? The replies came swiftly, each more chilling than the last. But one comment stood out the most. "She didn't vanish, she's still there." Beneath the comment was a video. The video you're watching right now. The engine of the old station wagon coughed and sputtered as Mia pulled into the secluded clearing, the dense woods swallowing up the faint twilight. She stepped out, her boots crunching on frost-bitten leaves. A frigid wind slithered through the towering trees, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of decay. Mia had been here before, but never physically. The stories on the conspiracy forums described the area as cursed, a stretch of forgotten land where the past had buried a secret too terrible to unearth. They called it the Veil for a reason. Anyone who tried to peel it back either disappeared or went insane. She glanced at her phone, the screen displaying a series of garbled messages from the group chat. "I knew we should have come here together," she muttered under her breath, while staring at the last coherent message from Matt. "We're on to something big. Meet us here at 6 p.m. It was already 6:30. No sign of Matt or anyone else. The air seemed unnaturally heavy as she stepped toward the crumbling remains of a stone structure jutting out from the forest floor. The structure didn't belong here or anywhere. Its jagged edges looked as if they had been melted and reformed into unnatural angles. Patterns etched into the surface, pulsing faintly like veins beneath translucent skin. She reached out to touch it. Something about the surface seemed alive. The snap of a branch behind her made her jump upright. She swung her flashlight around, the beam slicing through the darkness, catching fleeting glimpses of gnarled trunks and skeletal branches. She called for Matt, Anna, anyone? Silence pressed back against her, thick and suffocating. From the shadows a low hum began to rise, a sound that burrowed into her skull, resonating deep in her chest. 2 months earlier, the forums had been a battleground of speculation. A series of mysterious deaths had swept through small rural towns. Victims were found miles from their homes, their faces frozen in expressions of abject terror, their bodies untouched by any visible harm. Autopsies revealed elevated levels of adrenaline and cortisol. Their hearts had simply given out from fear. Mia, from a journalist turned into internet sleuth, it was the kind of mystery she couldn't resist. Theories ranged from chemical leaks to alien experiments to cult activity. But it was Matt's discovery that tipped the scales. A local archivist with access to declassified documents. Matt had uncovered records of an abandoned research facility in dense woods. Joint project between the military and a shadowy corporation. The project, codenamed Eidolon, had been terminated abruptly in the 1970s. All records sealed. Mia's obsession grew. Her late nights turned into early mornings as she pored over maps, survivor testimonies, and cryptic photos posted by anonymous users. The pieces didn't fit until they did. And here she was, standing at ground zero, the place where it all began. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the soles of her feet. It felt coming from the stone structure. Against her better judgment, she moved closer, her fingers itching to document every detail. As she leaned in, her phone buzzed violently in her pocket. She fumbled to answer, relief washing over her when she saw Matt's name on the screen. "Matt, where are you, and where is everyone else? Get out," his voice rasped, barely audible over the static. The rest of his words were too distorted to understand before the line went dead. Mia's breath hitched as a cold dread coiled in her stomach. She backed away from the structure, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But before she could turn, a shadow shifted at the edge of her vision. She froze with the flashlight trembling in her grip. A figure emerged from the darkness that looked like a man, or what was left of one. The face was a patchwork of raw, blistered flesh, and his eyes were weirdly blue. He tried to stumble toward her, his movement unnatural. "Don't look," he said, his voice gurgling as blood bubbled from his lips. "Don't let it see you," were his words while collapsing down. Mia's heart pounded in her ears, her hands shaking. She didn't have time to process what had just happened. Moments after his collapse, a guttural growl echoed, one that didn't belong to any animal she knew. She bolted, weaving through the trees, her flashlight bouncing erratically. The growling grew louder, closer, and she dared a glance over her shoulder. What she saw defied explanation. A mass of shifting shadows, its form constantly in flux, surged after her. It had no eyes, no discernible features, yet she felt its gaze boring into her, peeling away every layer of her being. The cabin appeared out of nowhere, its windows dark and lifeless. Mia didn't think twice before barreling through the door, slamming it shut behind her. She shoved a heavy bookshelf against it, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. But she knew better than to believe she was safe. The cabin's interior was sparse, its walls lined with yellowed newspapers and Polaroid photographs. The articles spoke of unexplained phenomena, while the photos depicted blurry figures in the woods, always on the edge of the frame. In the center of the room sat a weathered journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Mia opened it, the pages filled with frantic scrawls and diagrams. The veil is not a metaphor. It is a boundary, a membrane between worlds. They've been trying to breach it for decades. We are the collateral. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. The final page stopped her cold. If you're reading this, it's already too late. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. "Mia!" A voice called from outside. The voice was unmistakably Matt's, but he never called her by her first name. He always called her M or Chief. "Mia, I was supposed to be here with you. I know what you saw in the woods, and I know you're scared. Please, open the door." The knocking stopped. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she strained to hear anything. while from the other side of the cabin came chilling whispers. Mia turned slowly, the flashlight beam catching a figure standing in the corner. It was Matt, or at least it looked like him. His eyes were hollow, his expression a grotesque mockery of humanity. "You're not real," she said. The thing smiled back at her by saying, "Neither are you." The walls of the cabin began to warp, the room stretching and twisting as reality fractured around her. The air buzzed with an electric charge, and the shadows came alive, reaching for her. Mia screamed, her voice swallowed by the growing hum. When she woke, the clearing was empty. The stone structure was gone, the forest silent. Her phone buzzed in her pocket with notifications from the group chat. A message from the Matt, where he was asking her if she's still up for tonight. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling. In the distance, the faint hum began to rise again. The veil had been lifted. It was only the beginning. The stench of decay lingered in the air as Detective Eliza stepped over the crumpled body of the young woman. Her skin had turned a sickly shade of gray, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. A feeling crawled under her skin, as though something had taken her soul before she even realized it was gone. Eliza's eyes narrowed as she glanced around the isolated, decaying mansion where the body was found. The old house had been abandoned for years, sitting at the edge of the woods like a forgotten monument to some darker past. There was no trace of any human presence, yet the woman's body had been found in the upstairs study, positioned as if she had collapsed in middle of sentence. Eliza's hand hovered over the woman's outstretched hand, her fingers just a breath away. A soft rustling sound came from the far side of second floor. She drew her gun, stepping further into the room, eyes scanning every corner. The hairs on her neck stood up, but she couldn't afford to be afraid. Over the next few weeks, similar cases popped up. In other parts of the city, young women were found alone in their homes or in secluded locations with no obvious motives behind the killings. The common thread was chilling. Each had been seen near the old mansion days before their demise. As Eliza sifted through the case files, she discovered something even more disturbing. All the victims had been researching the mansion's history. A former owner, Dr. Robert, had been a reclusive scientist in the 1920s, known for his dangerous experiments with unexplained energy sources. Rumors of his dark research persisted, but no evidence had ever been found. Most dismissed the old man's legacy as a myth, but Eliza wasn't so sure anymore. She found a group of amateurs online. The group been sharing and investigating Dr. Robert's experiments, unknowingly piecing together a trail that led to the mansion. They had dug into public records, old journals, and the scattered, incomplete notes Dr. Robert left behind. Each member contributed to tracing the timeline of deaths and events, slowly building a theory about a dangerous property hidden within the mansion's walls. Their findings were chilling. A series of failed experiments with energy had reportedly left traces of residual radiation, a deadly force that Robert had unsuccessfully attempted to control. The online group had come to one terrifying conclusion. Something within the mansion was still active. It had been waiting all this time to be fed. The mansion was likely a part of something, a something that had been operating in the shadows for decades. Eliza couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that the theories weren't just theories anymore. The group was onto something, and they were getting closer. Eliza joined their online discussions under the guise of an anonymous participant, learning what they had uncovered. One user under username Spectre89 was particularly detailed. They had traced the mansion's ownership back to the early 1900s, revealing a secret deal between Dr. Robert and several government officials, an agreement to bury the truth about his dangerous experiments. Documents had been hidden, and some, it seemed, had even been destroyed. In a chilling post, Spectre89 wrote, "We've been searching for answers, but what we've discovered isn't a coincidence. The deaths are connected to something far worse than we thought. Dr. Roberts' experiment wasn't just a failed scientific endeavor. It was an attempt to open a doorway, a portal to something beyond our understanding. Eliza felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This couldn't be real. The evidence was mounting when another body was discovered. One of the group members wrote a clear message. Someone, or something, didn't want the truth to be uncovered. The investigation took Eliza to the heart of the city's underbelly. Shadowy government offices, forgotten archives, and underground networks. She had no idea who to trust anymore. Everything felt shady and tangled. Her own doubts crept in, as she realized she was trapped in a web of secrecy, surrounded by people who either didn't know the whole truth or were too afraid to speak it. Every piece of information she uncovered seemed to confirm that there was more to the mansion than just the mad scientist's legacy. One of the most shocking revelations came when a former colleague of hers, who had worked as a historian specializing in the paranormal, reached out to Eliza in desperation. He had recently been researching Dr. Roberts' work as well and discovered something sinister. Before he could share more, he was found dead, his body left in the same manner as the others. The more Eliza learned, the more questions she had. The people she had once trusted were now potential suspects or victims. Eliza's investigation led her back to the mansion. By now she was no longer just looking for answers, she was running out of time. The group she had joined were barely active. Its most engaged members had stopped coming online. Eliza stood outside the mansion's gates, staring at the looming structure. There was no going back. As Eliza stepped inside, the oppressive atmosphere closed in around her. It was as though the house itself was waiting for something, or someone to disturb its secrets. The study where the first body had been found still had the same cold, haunting stillness. Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as the air seemed to thicken. Her flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. Distorted shadows revealing a door, hidden behind a tapestry. It was a door she hadn't noticed before. Inside the room was unlike anything she'd expected. Papers were scattered everywhere. Scribbled notes and incomplete formulas painted a picture of a mind on the brink of madness. But what struck Eliza most was the large metal structure in the center of the room, a machine, clearly constructed by Dr. Robert himself, and at its core was a strange, pulsating energy source, glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the machine. The ground beneath her shook. The machine resembled the gateway Spectre 89 had mentioned, something that Dr. Robert had tried to open, but had never fully controlled. The online group had been right all along, but their discovery had cost them their lives. The truth was out, but it had come at a terrible price. Months later, Eliza's investigation was deemed inconclusive, her findings dismissed. The online group's files had disappeared, their presence wiped from every server. The mansion had been sealed off, its secrets buried once more, while Eliza was written off as obsessed, a fringe theorist with no credibility. The higher-ups dismissed her warnings and made her look crazy, her voice lost in a sea of denial. The 4 bodies were found in a remote desert area, all dead under strange circumstances. Their faces were twisted in agony, their bodies seemingly drained of life. The official report stated that the group had died of a drug overdose. Those who knew the victims insisted that they were so-called treasure hunters, who believed in the existence of an ancient artifact known only as stone. They dedicated their lives on searching for it and had nothing to do with drugs. To the victims' families, a harmless hobby had become a chilling reality, raising the unsettling possibilities that the legends were true. The stone itself were described in ancient text as a relic that had a power of draining the life out of those who held it. Initially dismissed as a myth, a dangerous tale for those with overactive imaginations. A tale that will carry puzzled, chilling, contradicting claims with it. Treasure hunters and archaeologists had been obsessed with finding it for decades. Numerous private-funded searchers, armed with the latest technology and old folklore, had come up empty-handed till this day. Some believed it was buried deep within the heart of an ancient ruin, which location is unknown. Others believed that it was concealed under miles of desert sands, while some theorized it was lost in the depths of the ocean. Myth got its first public attention only after the 4 bodies were found. Authorities claimed that there was more than 4 people based on the footprints and other evidence, but no information was revealed about who could be the others. Media couldn't stop questioning why authorities blamed the deaths on drugs, especially when the victims' families clearly stated it had something to do with so-called stone. As more conspiracy theories spread, the more shocking information came in. 8 more deaths had been reported. The official statement confirmed that those who had initially reported the 4 bodies in deserted area were also dead, alongside with those who investigated the scene. It started to become believable that all those who have died been somehow in contact with the stone. No one knew for sure what was going on, but it was the only logical explanation. People who once thought the stone was a myth now feared its existence. Meanwhile, among those who dedicated their lives in search of the stone was in a demand for answers. It was clear as day that the officials were pushing out incomplete information. They believed the stone had actually been found, and that's what triggered the sudden chain of deaths. The stone, as the legends said, was no mere artifact. It had the power to drain the life force of anyone who touched it, but whoever could hold it without dying became a chosen immortal. Ancient language translations may not be accurate, but if they are, then it's obvious why it attracts wealthy individuals and corporations. The fear of having such power in someone's hand is terrifying to think about. In ancient times, the stone was described as a dark, matte object, its surface resembling obsidian, yet it absorbed all incoming light. As one drew closer, the air grew colder, sending a chill deep into the bones. The stone consumed not just light but vitality, draining the energy from everything around it. Its purpose was both sacred and sinister. Used in ancient rituals to extend the lives of gods, it served as a key to immortality. What was once a force of darkness is now dismissed as legend, yet with each soul taken, its existence grows more undeniable. The current situation, in the middle of it all, is blurred and chaotic. What would you do if such object was within your reach? Officials continued to claim the deaths were isolated incidents, unrelated to the mythical stone, and that no artifact had been found. These words meant nothing to the groups of believers who started to look for answers on their own. That's when a group of people online gathered together to see with their own eyes what had actually happened in that deserted area. When they arrived, what was once said to be an isolated tragedy had now become an imposing military zone. A temporary research facility had been built, which drastically standing out in contrast to the vast, barren desert. From even a distance, could see that there is someone walking with a full white bodysuit inside the compound. The group, armed with cameras, began recording everything they could, capturing the facility's structure and the strange controlled activity within. They chatted excitedly among themselves, certain that the stone was there. Every frame of footage only reinforced their beliefs. Posting it all online made people realize that the officials had been blowing dust in their eyes all this time. The posts quickly gained traction, sparking intense speculation. Why would such a heavy military presence guarding an area where supposedly people died from drug overdose? The more people questioned the official story, the more the stone legend seemed real. What if past repeats itself and this place becomes a new Area 51? Guess we'll never know.